your video and mute your microphone, and we will start right away.
Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Let attendees continue to arrive. Welcome to everybody. This is the CFA Practice Standards webinar on starting a CTF, and we're just giving people another minute or two to log in, and then we'll get going. I would invite you, if you can, to add into the chat where you're coming from, who you are. Make sure that you address it to everyone. The default is it comes up to hosts and panelists, so please change it to everyone so that everyone can see where you're coming from. And we'll get started in about another minute. All right, why don't we get things underway? So again, this is Katie Mathias from the Conservation Finance Alliance and the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I welcome you to the 11th webinar on the 2020 edition of the Practice Standards. We've started this webinar series in January of this year. We've been very excited by the attendance and appreciate everyone who has presented over the last 11 months and who has participated in the webinars. So just a few quick housekeeping details before we get started. If you can, please share with us in the chat who you are and where you're coming from so that we can see who's participating. I can see just from the list of participants that there is quite a bit of experience in starting a conservation trust fund. So I look forward to the discussion as we get to the discussion portion of the agenda. So we'll have have three great speakers today. First, we'll have Scott Lantman, who leads the Tropical Forest Conservation Act Secretariat at USAID, who will provide an overview of the issues involved in starting a conservation trust fund and how the standards can be relevant. Scott was a member of both this working group and the working group that created the original 2014 edition of the standards. So he brings great perspective, including as someone who's been part of setting up quite a few conservation trust funds through TFCA. And then we'll have case studies from Miriam DeKoning, who's the executive director of the Prespa Orid Nature Trust, and Sasha Middleton, who's the CEO of the Marine Ecosystem Protected Area Trust. So if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just click Q&A and type in the question. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll pose those to the panelists. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
Hello, can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my share screen here and see if I can get the PowerPoint up on the screen. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is something you've already seen, but I wanted to show you the speakers this morning, and it's a privilege to be a part of this, especially this using the standards for starting a CTF, because of the years of being in the Secretariat and having tried to do this and negotiate agreements. But the interesting thing, I'm going to give this an overview, a contextual overview of this subject matter, but I didn't coordinate with Sasha or Miriam, so it'll be really interesting to see the reality on the field that they'll speak of, and they can say I'm full of baloney when they get to that point. But I'm just going to lead you through a couple of observations if this is going to advance for me here. Uh-oh. How do I advance this?
Maybe, Scott, maybe you can stop sharing and start sharing again. That may help. And if not, we can help you with that.
Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go back in. I'm going to start differently here. Let's see if I can do it this way. Awesome. Okay, here we go. This is simply the standards. Most of you on the line this morning are quite familiar with this, but this was an update of a 2014 set of practice standards. And the URL or the location of this is given on the screen, but I know that it'll be given in the chat as well for those of you that would like to look at the entirety of the standards. This is the content of the standards. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to familiarize those of you that have not seen this, that there are a number of core areas in the document. You can read them here. And then in this 2020 version, there were these cross-cutting themes that were established on communications and human resources and technology and monitoring and evaluation. So this was the structure and the content of the standards. Now the goals for the standards. This is interesting because one of the goals was a tool for design of CTFs. When I was on the task force, I really didn't think of it in terms so much of design as evaluation of current CTFs. And so when I was asked to do this talk this morning, I had to put on a different hat and try to look at this document in the context of how it applied to setting up a CTF. And when you look at the entirety of the document, the one area that really addresses this specifically is Annex 1. And the annex here is entitled Prioritizing Standards at Different Stages of the CTF Evolution. And you can see in the first top box there, these are the 5 stages of evolution that were considered in the document. And then in the lower box, you have the most of the annex is this sort of a thing where you list in the column all the standards. And then on the rows, you have the stages, and they put little X's to indicate where in the sequence that standard is applied. And when I was looking at this, and I think you'll see in the examples, there's a bit of subjectivity to this. And that's recognized. And so I wanted to just read this one little sentence from the document. It says, at each of these different levels of evolution, CTFs will find that some standards have more immediacy than others. Some CTFs will be able to invest in standardizing more procedures and systems during the startup. and early operational phases, while others, CTFs, may have to prioritize different standards to meet donor expectations at a given point in time. So, clearly the document itself recognizes that that there's a bit of subjectivity to when these standards apply. And my dog is bothering me right now, so I apologize for that. Now, there's two observations I want to make from a donor's perspective about the document itself. This is in terms of setting up starting a CTF. The first thing of importance to say is there's really a document sequencing involved in these things. There are the laws which lead to the agreements, the bilateral agreements, which lead to bylaws and charters, and then on down the line here. And they are tiered in terms of priority sequencing. And the lower documents will often incorporate by reference those elements from above. And the lower documents can actually elaborate and expand on some of the issues, but they can't deviate from what the authorization is above. And that's why these are a prioritization and of a tiering of documents. And I say this, virtually all CTFs are predicated on this tiering of documents. And it's not just CTFs. On the bottom here, I mentioned that sometimes you create a new donor program account within an existing CTF. And so there's a lot of the same application in that context as well. And you'll note that the majority, in terms of our topic today of starting a CTF, most of the relevant documents here are the top tier, the laws, the agreements, and the bylaws. Having said that, I want to give just a couple of examples. On the left, we have the document sequencing that I just referenced. On the right, the example is from the asset management standards. And I give here, we have number 1, number 5, and number 6 that I selected. Now, you can see number 1 is the standard is that specifies the need for a clear, comprehensive investment policies. Well, by golly, the donors care about that. And so it's going to appear up in the agreements themselves and then tier down. And the policies themselves, the investment policy statements, will often be down at the bottom here when the committees of the board actually elaborate on those themes. So you see a multi-levels addressed. The blue arrow here specifies the governance body approves the policies and selects an asset manager. Well, clearly the agreements are going to say that in the bylaws. So, and at the bottom here, this is interesting. It's low. It's number 6 in the ranking of the standards here. It's not a ranking, but listing of the standards. It specifies that CTF's government bodies, the composition and the skill sets required. Well, by golly, the donors care about that. And so once again, you're way up often at the law itself. In our case, TFCA, we require an NGO majority on the board, and that's specified in the actual statute, the law. So, once again, you see the mixing and matching of standards in relation to the sequencing of the documents themselves. I wanted to look at the administration standards as my second example, and I only have 2 here. I didn't want to overwhelm you. But number 6 specifies that CTFs will have sufficient overhead rates to achieve institutional strategic objectives. And I'm paraphrasing these things. Well, once again, donors care about your overhead rates. They don't want you to be spending too much on overhead. So that's up at the top level of documents. It's often going to be in the agreements themselves. And down at the bottom, well, you have to have strategic objectives indicated. And so when your plans come out, you're going to have your conservation plans, your strategic plans, et cetera, elaborated down at about number 6 here in terms of orders. And then the other example on my screen here is just specifies the need for operation manuals. And once again, in my list, it's a little bit lower on the level. There's an interesting point I like to make here when we're negotiating these agreements, and that's the farther down you can push your specification of an issue, the easier it is to amend it in the future. So for instance, if there's an overhead rate specified in the agreement, well, that's going to be a lot more difficult to amend than if it were deferred down to the board of directors to make that decision. So that's really something to keep in mind when you're negotiating the startup of a CTF. I have one last slide, and I'm going to let my dog out. Lacey, go. Sorry. My last slide here is the other observation I wanted to make was in structural sequencing. And the great example here is when you're negotiating an agreement, you have an actual signature date when everybody celebrates. Yes, we have a new swap, debt swap, or bilateral agreement. Well, you know, it doesn't actually enter into force. And by that, I mean the money actually ends up in the accounts until months later often. And there's this time lag. So what is in that time lag? Well, there's a number of conditions stated in the agreements themselves. And there's examples listed here. The ratification of the agreement. Some countries have to have a legislature ratify the agreement. You have the legal registration of the actual fund. You have the establishment of the governance body. And then very importantly, the select a fiscal agent and sign the trust agreement, because you have to have a place to put the monies once you enter into force. And then of course, hire an executive director. So there's a lot of front end structural sequencing that's required even before the document, the agreement, enters into force. And the last thing I want to say, and before I pass it on to my colleagues, is, you know, it's interesting that if you look at this, the fund itself doesn't have the monies to put into developing these conditions, and because they can't access the monies until later. Well, oftentimes donors, which cannot capitalize your funds or your endowments necessarily, can actually help you in this regard. You can go and access their project monies to be able to support some of these other front-end conditionalities. So I think I've rambled on enough. I hope it made sense to everybody. And now I'm going to pass it back to my colleagues.
Scott, thank you so much. That was great. And I think helpful to everybody to have a sense of the steps and the sequencing of the process, which I think can oftentimes be confusing. So I just want to take a quick reminder to remind you that if you have questions for any of the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. We're discussing amongst ourselves before the webinar started that this is one of those topics that you don't necessarily know that you need until you need it. So I would also encourage you, particularly for those of you who have been through the process of starting up conservation trust funds, is to think about what you wish you knew before you started the CTF, and to put that in the Q&A, because I think people may not even know what they don't know yet. So with that, let me turn the screen over to Miriam de Koning, who is the Executive Director of the Presbyter Nature Trust. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kathy. Let me start looking at the PowerPoint and get it running. All right. There you go, this should work. Yeah, happy to present about the Presbyter Nature Trust. I think we are not that new anymore. We are now in our 5th year, but it was nice to reflect on what happened in these 5 years that I've been on board. And I will focus on these core areas that Scott just mentioned. That is already quite a task, and I left the cross-cutting themes out for now, not to overburden everybody. Let me start with governance. Actually, before I entered the pond end of 2016, but legally it was established in 2015. So some of the steps with a lot of work happened before I came. And as Scott also said, we were very lucky that the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund financed one of our founding members and the board members, also WWF Greece, to do a feasibility study for ponds and set this all up and to be able to finance it via them. Our charter is from 2015. It starts with defining the focus region of ponds, which was quite limited, the Prespa Lakes, shared by 3 countries, Greece, Albania, North Macedonia, a transboundary area. But what was very good is in the charter, there was also already an outline for the potential growth of ponds to move beyond, to go to the Ochrid area and even within the entire 3 countries. We have a two-tiered board structures with duties and responsibilities described in the bylaws. We have a supervisory board with skills in legal issues, investment issues, and with a substantive knowledge of the region. As we are a transboundary trust fund, we have, we don't have, in that case, government people of the countries in our board, but more the non-for-profit people and donors in our board. There's a management board with more conservation and social background. We have 4 supervisory board meetings per year with signed minutes of meeting. The investment portfolio is run via an investment committee, which reports to the supervisory board. And one of our supervisory board members is heading the investment committee. As a transboundary conservation trust fund, POND is legally established in Germany. And this was based on a very detailed legal study of the legal opportunities within the 3 countries and say somewhere outside of the region, what would be the best option? And it was concluded it was in Germany. If we go to institutional effectiveness, when I came, there was already a log frame developed by our founding members, MAVA Foundation and KfW on behalf of the German government in this intensive feasibility phase that took place for say 1 to 1.5 years. So when I came and I started to work on the first strategy, I could really base it on the studies conducted during this feasibility study. So I had a lot of data to work from. There were already public consultation meetings done in the 3 countries, and I could build upon that. I had framework agreements with the governments. I did that when I arrived. It took half a year to a year with most of the countries. And from the early stages, I actually started to develop a financial model to simulate all the projections of income and expenditures. We started with an endowment of 3 million from the MAVA Foundation. We soon had a sinking fund from the MAVA Foundation. We had a sinking fund from KfW and more endowment. And we have continuously updated our financial model to see the income is expected each year, what can the expenditures be, and how long can we maintain this. We have a very close cooperation with other donors in the region, also because we require co-financing, but also to work on synergies and to avoid duplication. From the start, when I came, already a website was developed, and I continued following with a LinkedIn page and a Facebook page. So yeah, currently we started in the wider Presbyter area. We worked there for 4 years, and after 4 years, we had 15 grants. In October this year, we were very happy. We could also expand to the wider Ochrid area, which both Lake Ochrid and Lake Prespa, the oldest lakes of Europe, a real biodiversity hotspot. And at the moment, we have, after 5 years, 24 ongoing grants. As you can see in this map, we have the protected areas there around the lakes. Almost the entire region is protected area, proclaimed, but we have also many, many international designations because of the biodiversity importance of this area. We have a mixed natural World Heritage Site. We have the first transboundary park in the Balkans. In the yellow, it's the transboundary Prespa Park, and it's all embedded in a big transboundary Ochrid Prespa Biosphere Reserve. Our mission is really to have long-term financing in this area and to enable partnerships within countries, between governments and civil society organizations, but also between the boundaries in the transboundary cooperation. For the programs, POND really focused on the identified gaps that were identified in the feasibility study, and the gaps are financing of operational cost of protected areas, and there's a lack of long-term financing and capacity development for local organizations, such as protected area management authorities, NGOs, local municipalities, and research institutes. In year 5, at the moment, we are developing our impact indicators in addition to the log frame that already also had indicators. We have a grants manual developed. We have application templates, and we ensure quality of the applications by using a scoring card, always with a 4I principle to score every grant application using this scoring card, which has technical elements, governance elements, administrative elements, and so forth. Most of our grants, not the protected areas because they are there, but for the other grant program on NGOs and municipalities and research institutes, we have open call for proposals. And in case the grant goes well, they can have a follow-up grant. We do regular coaching of our grantees via Skype calls or physical visits. And in year 4, in 2020, we actually did another feasibility study for our next phase for the geographical expansion. And that was to go from Prespa also to include Ochrid. And at the moment, we are even already looking at the third geographical expansion option. So the growth is really going quite well. 2 grants program, one focusing on protected areas where the protected areas really work with specialists and local partners, but because we all know they cannot do it all themselves. We call that environmental actors, and both the protected areas can have grants from us and the environmental actors. So we create, for each protected area, we are creating partnerships for an effective management of these protected areas and transboundary cooperation. Our grantee map, 24 ongoing grants in the area distributed over the 4 countries, some through direct grants and the others all via call for proposals. We had 2 joint call for proposals together with the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, the fund that helped us at the start, and now we continue to cooperate together. Administration, maybe some of you have followed other webinars and you know that we have shared services via the Nature Trust Alliance in Frankfurt, where we are registered in the state of Hessen. And that's why I can be based in Tirana and Albania and be close to the region to concentrate on the program. Nature Trust Alliance is giving services on administration, finance, IT, HR, data protection, and investments for 4 CTFs, all registered in Hessen. Caucasus Nature Fund, Blue Action Fund, Legacy Landscape Funds are my sister foundations, and we work together on many issues. We have an operational manual, we have an employee handbook, and we have procedures in place. As highlighted, asset management, an investment committee under my supervisory board. But what is very special is that we have a shared investment committee with a shared investment policy and sustainability guidelines for the 4 CTFs that are under NTA to have more efficient investment structure. Resource mobilization, the financial model that I developed with the help of NTA, we had already geographical expansion scenarios, which helps us with the financial projections, which helps us in fundraising with our existing donors and other future donors, which has been very successful. We are at the moment in year 5, we have a capital of 60 million euro, which is of course fantastic. It really had substantial growth. We have a fundraising strategy with targets in place. And at the moment in year 5, I'm developing the Pond environmental social management system to address risk management and safeguards. And from Albania, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward for your questions and answers. Hope to answer them. Thanks, Kathy. Back to you.
Miriam, thank you so much for that great presentation. That was really interesting and helpful. I'm going to turn it over quickly to Sasha Middleton, who's the CEO of the Marine Ecosystem Protected Area Trust in Antigua and Barbuda. And Sasha, with that, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. So far, I'm enjoying the presentations. Thus far, I'm just learning from each and every one of you. As Katie mentioned, I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. The Marine Ecosystems Protected Area Trust is one of 10 conservation trust funds set up throughout the Caribbean region through the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. And the MEPA Trust is actually based here in Antigua. Next slide, please. So the Marine Ecosystems Protected Area Trust was actually established in May 2015, and our main objective is to support marine and terrestrial conservation related activities through grant making. Can you just do the next slide? So it is a majority NGO board. As you would see here, we have 6 non-governmental organizations, 2 private sector entities, and 2 government entities. Now, these are different type of board members that we have from the Environmental Awareness Group, the Nature Conservancy, Integrated Health Outreach. We have the Fisheries Division, the Antigua and Barbuda Marine Association. I'm taking the time out to do this to show you the different types of sectors that we have currently on the board. You know, even though it's a majority NGO board, we also have government on the board as well, just to build that partnerships as well, strengthening the partnership with both the government, NGOs, and the private sector. Next slide. So as you would see on the screen here, our overall mission and vision, we want to be able to work with different sectors on different partners as well to catalyze funding to support the protection and recovery of our marine protected areas in Antigua and Barbuda so that we're able to build the resilience and the impacts of climate change. Now, some of the things that, and some of the principles that the Marine Ecosystems Protected Area Trust stands for is that we are built on transparency and integrity, accountability, capacity building, cooperation and inclusivity, conservation and sustainability, empowerment and equity, as well as dedication and volunteerism. The board is a majority board, NGO board, and it also is a voluntary board as well. So each board member is not really being compensated for it. So we actually very much is appreciative of the board members sitting on the board and giving so much of their time. Next slide. Now, I would just, as Scott and my other colleague has mentioned, I'm just going to give you an overview basically of what are some of the standards that the MEPA Trust have implemented and will be implementing in the future. We have highlighted the governance, the administration, asset management, resource mobilization, as well as risk management. Next slide. Next slide. All right, perfect. So in terms of governance, we have governing documents clearly defining the composition and powers and the responsibilities of the MEPA Trust Board and the Secretariat via our bylaws, our articles of incorporation, our operational manual, our human resources manual. We have different policies in place, as well as our terms of references for each of the board members so that they understand, as well as for the Secretariat to understand what is it their responsibilities are as it relates to working with the MEPA Trust and working for the MEPA Trust. Board members are also appointed based on their competencies and commitment to contribute meaningfully to the MEPA Trust overall vision and mission. As I stated before, you would recognize that we have a wide variety of skills and expertise on our board. And I want to also stress on the part that it says meaningfully, because a lot of times, you know, you might have board members, but they're not able to contribute as much as you would like them to. So we have very much a dedicated board, and going forward that we would want individuals joining the MEPA Trust Board to be very much involved. We have specialized committees as well that are able to provide support to the MEPA Trust Board. So the MEPA Trust has a technical advisory committee board. We also have an executive member board. So these are some of and we have a hiring committee as well that is responsible for hiring of the different staff to the MEPA Trust Board. The MEPA Trust has at least 3 meetings per year and has accurate records of our meetings. The MEPA Trust recruited and recruiting staff to conduct its operations. So currently, for instance, we have a CEO, which is myself. We have a financial accountant. We're in the process of hiring a program officer, and some of the project consultants that we've had on board were just for a short time. But we want to have a fully funded staff on board and full-time basically. MEPA Trust also maintains a compliance list to monitor and ensure full compliance with the laws nationally as well as internationally. So I have an Excel sheet where I have this in place because there's so many things happening all at once. So you want to be able to follow suit and know what you're doing. Institutional effectiveness, we have work plans, financial plans, and we will be putting all of these things in place every single year to ensure that it guides the board as well as the MEPA Trust Secretariat in the direction that it needs to go. Partnerships and synergies have been built at the national level as well as the international level. We have built the partnerships with the government, private sector, non-government. Even at the international spaces, we are a member, for instance, for REDLAC, we are a member of the Conservation Finance Alliance, we are a member of UN Environment, and we try to be a part of these organizations so that we are able to learn, share, build the synergies at the local, international level as well. The MEPA Trust has internal reporting, both narrative and financial mechanisms in place to report throughout to the board as well, for the Secretariat to show our progress. We have, we report constantly to different audiences for different purposes. The MEPA Trust also maintain public presence. So we have a website. It's mepatrustantiguaandbarbuda.org. We also have a Facebook page as well. The MEPA Trust also clearly convey our values, missions, program goals, and impact all over in our institutional documents as well. Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. As it relates to our programs, when awarding grants, the MEPA Trust has evaluated potential grantees by requiring them to submit essential information. So the information may be, information with regards to your track record in terms of how much funds have you, managed in the past, what are the projects that you have implemented, how long have you been established. These are some of the things that we use to be able to assess the grantees. We have well-defined grant award processes that have been established. So we have a grant making manual, and we also have the processes that we need, for our actual grantees to follow as well and clearly be able to apply for grants. So we have this in our manual as well as on our webpage. We have grant award cycles are concluded with a signed contract. So contracts indicate what you need to do, how it needs to be done. The reporting templates are also within these contracts. We build the capacity as well for potential grantees. So through the MEPA Trust, our previous chairman, Gary Gore, he actually started aiding community groups to be legally registered at absolutely no cost, so that they're able to tap into donor funding, not just from the MEPA Trust, but also from other organizations as well. And this is a way for us to build their capacities. We help them with their institutional documents as well, and sharing as well helps them. Clear reporting template and frameworks are also provided to the grantees. MEPA Trust also mobilize staff to monitor the grantees' progresses. Resource mobilization. The MEPA Trust analyze and pursue opportunities using funds from different donors and governments, to leverage additional resources. Hurricane Irma, for instance, it devastated our sister island, Barbuda, in 2017. And the International Community Foundation, as well as with other organizations, they decided that they wanted to channel funds through the MEPA Trust to get onto the ground in Barbuda. We have mobilized over, I would say, $1 million to Barbuda in the hurricane recovery efforts. And that was one of the ways in which that we were able to build our capacity, as well as to gain funding for our overhead costs and to help in, assisting with, all of our different operational costs or for staff, those type of things. The MEPA Trust has also explored opportunities to serve as financial intermediaries for donor programs, as I just mentioned. We also seek the support of national government ministries and international donors to work with the Trust and to support our mandate and aiding in that as well. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is one of our main donors, and we also have to find matching funding to support that. One of the things that we also do is that we encourage cost sharing arrangements with our grantees by, indicating to them that in order for you to get this grant, you would have to, let's say, put in-kind support to your project. This also demonstrates that they're also building partnerships as well. Next slide. Administration. So as I mentioned earlier, we have various policies in place, our HR policies, operational manual is in place. We have clear terms of references and financial budgets in place. We have clear organizational charts as well. So you're able to see, have a visual picture of what our structure is like in the MEPA Trust. We have performance reviews on staff. We conduct annual audits as well by independent auditors every single year. We have up-to-date software in place for financial management, email management, those type of things. We have proper procurement rules and policies as well to guide us in terms of those type of, getting goods and services for the MEPA Trust. We also, as I didn't mention this, but as I indicated earlier, we have different policies like conflict of interest policies to ensure that we are operating above ground, and that we have fiduciary responsibilities that we must uphold with all of our donors and partners. So we ensure that we are transparent. We have resources that maximize for funding and grant making programs. And we also have staff members are compensated based on their qualifications and experience and not on nepotism or favoritism. Next slide. I just highlighted just a few in this to not overwhelm everybody. The MEPA Trust has adopted recognized national, international, environmental, and social safeguard policies. So in Antigua and Barbuda, we currently have the Environment Management Protection Act. And in this act, it basically stated that NGOs, civil society organizations, everyone must be involved in decision-making to ensure that we protect their safeguards as well. So we actually go off of what is implemented nationally. We have policies that are in place to protect the safety and well-being of our staff through our HR policy as well. Through asset management, the MEPA Trust has an asset register to take a note of all the assets that we currently have. And we also recognize the importance of investing our assets that are consistent with our missions and core values. Next slide. And next steps, most conservation trust fund would definitely say that we are low on staff. So our next step is definitely to hire more staff, conduct staff and board training ever so often. So we want to also have that in place, put in place a concrete fundraising and resource mobilization strategy and investment strategy, as well as finalizing our strategic plan for 2022 to 2027. And also to mobilize more funding for grants. Next slide. I think this brings me to the end of my presentation. This is just pictures of all of our partners and local and internationally as well. Thank you so much for having me, and feel free to ask questions.
Great, Sasha, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I appreciate the, particularly since I know you just got back from Glasgow, the amount of detail that was provided. Thank you. So I want to address the questions that are in the Q&A and pose them to the panel. If you do have questions, please type them into the question and answer. One question that came up is whether it's possible to share some of these instruments and templates from Ren and Rosha. And I want to highlight that there is a resource on the Conservation Finance Alliance website called the Environmental Funds Toolkit, which is a compendium of documents, policies, and other resources that have been compiled by CTFs over the years. So I'm going to put a link to the toolkit in the chat, but I also want to flag that one of the upcoming projects of the Environmental Funds Working Group of the CFA, which is one of the sponsors of this webinar series along with REDLAC, is to have a team from the Environmental Funds Working Group work on how to update the Environmental Funds Toolkit and solicit some newer documents. So there are a lot of great resources there. I know that there are people who have been relying on it for years, and we're also in the process of updating it. So that resource is available, and I encourage people to take a look, and particularly to be aware of specific context. So no one document is multi-purpose. It doesn't work for everybody. And both Scott and the presenters talked about the importance of feasibility analysis and conducting initial analysis to really understand what works in your specific context. And so I certainly don't encourage copying and pasting without analysis. The other question that's been posed is about sharing of presentations, and with the presenter's permission, we will put copies of the presentations on the CFA website. So if you go to the page that the webinar page, which has the a page for the specific webinar, the presentations as well as the recording will be there. And I think I put that link in the chat as well. So let me, while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I wanted to pose a question to both Sasha and Miriam. Scott talked about the sort of tricky in-between period, right, where you haven't necessarily obtained funding yet. The first grant or the first settlement hasn't come in, but there are costs associated with the design and feasibility and startup phases that you've described. So I wonder if you could each talk about, if you know offhand, like approximately how long did it take to go through the design and startup phases? What resources were involved in doing that, both who was involved and approximately like what the cost might have been, and who provided that initial startup funding before you became a fully operational entity? So Miriam's got her camera on. I'm going to pose that to Miriam first.
Yeah, we had the opportunity to benefit from WWF Greece, who's in our board. They applied for funding at the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, and they got a grant. I'm not sure about the total amount, but maybe it was 100,000, and they used that for the feasibility phase, 1.5 to 2 years. And then before really the first sinking funds came in, at the setup administratively, we also had the help of CNF, the Caucasus Nature Fund, through our Nature Trust Alliance scheme, which we then reimbursed when we had money. So that was another construct we benefited from. Yeah, so we had a grant via one of our board members, and we had some help from CNF to set up things.
Great, thank you. Sasha, do you have, let me turn it over to you if you've got response to that.
Sure, yes. So in terms of the startup, so even though we were established in May 2015, we actually became more so operational, I would say, in late 2016, early 2017. I would say the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has played an instrumental role in the MEPA Trust's growth. They gave us actually $185,000 US in tranches to help with the operational setups. Also, the Nature Conservancy as well aided us in providing in-kind support. Now, I want to also stress on the commitment of our board members as well. Some of our board members already came with some skills and expertise, so they were able to help with, giving us good documents for our bylaws and those type of things. Now, the government of Antigua and Barbuda, through the Department of Environment as well, has been extremely instrumental in setting up the MEPA Trust. In fact, the MEPA Trust had a partnership agreement with the Department of Environment to aid in terms of operational costs. So at the time, the MEPA Trust did not have any funding for office, for instance. So I was actually based in the Department of Environment, sharing an office space there. So it was a lot of in-kind support, I would say, from the Nature Conservancy, CBF board. CBF secretary provided both a financial as well as in-kind support, the Nature Conservancy, and overall the government of Antigua and Barbuda.
Great, thank you. There's another question that's come into the Q&A, which is asking, can we share more about the process of supporting local communities to establish organizations? Miriam or Sasha, do either one of you want to take that one, or Scott for that matter?
Maybe I can start that we are looking in our environmental grant program. We support some more experienced NGOs, and they work with local associations, and they actually coach them to establish themselves officially as legal organizations. So we grant to experienced NGOs who then help local communities to establish their own organization and start with a little bit of sub-granting. We cannot manage that all this small, but we are always looking for these intermediaries that can do that for us. And that's how we involve local communities. Also via the protected area park management, they have stakeholder councils. Of course, there's also a lot of cooperation with the local community.
Great, thank you. Sasha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. So as I actually said in my presentation earlier, my chair Gary Gore, well, my previous chair Gary Gore, he has been working with various entities, and he came with that skill where he was able to aid community groups. So if you have an idea, one of the things that we said, you have to be legally registered to tap into any donor funding, for instance. So what he has done, they lack guidance, and here in Antigua, it costs probably $5,000 for a lawyer to actually help a community group or anyone to get legally registered. And our chair actually took that on at no cost. He helped them with their institutional documents. We also had Miss Ruth Spencer, which is our vice chair. She's now the chair now. And Ruth Spencer, she actually works heavily with the community group. She aids them in writing funding proposals, not for proposals just specifically for MEPA Trust, but even to tap into funding from the small grants program, for instance, because she was back then the UNDP small grants program coordinator. So she was extremely involved with the community groups and still is very much involved with the community groups and building their capacity to write funding proposal, as well as how to monitor the progress and report back to donors. So those are some of the things that we've done in terms of involving community groups, and also going to their meetings in the evenings and sharing ideas and learning from them so that we're able to have a better projects and execution in our programs.
Great, thank you. Scott.
Yeah, just a quick word, actually. As you may know, there's a lot of TFCA funds globally. And the one that comes to mind is the Philippines. I know that when they first established a TFCA in the Philippines, they had a roadshow that went from island to island, asking for input in the actual design of the project itself. I mean, I don't know that that's been done elsewhere, but it was very impressive at an outreach to the communities in that particular case.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, while you've got your camera on, I think we have covered most of the questions, all the questions in the Q&A. One other question I just wanted to ask you from your perspective of having seen a lot of CPFs get off the ground is, generally speaking, how long have you seen it take from the time someone has a good idea and until there's actually an operating CPF in place? Because I'd like to help give people some realistic expectations that, we've heard about how long it took PONT and MEPA to get off the ground, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to determine which parts of the process need to be identified here, because I don't want to scare anybody. On the front end, I mean, it can take a year, quite frankly, from a country saying that we are interested in this program, TFCA, taking through all the confirmations, the congressional notifications, and all those sorts of things to get to a point where you negotiate the agreement and have it signed. And so, of course, you have the end of the fiscal year as the urgency to try to get it done. But that's just on the negotiating side on the front end. And it's slow, but there's a lot of agencies and organizations and departments involved. But when you get into the actual establishment after the signature of the document, I think it's much more rapid, especially if it's not just a bilateral agreement, but if it's a debt swap. And the way we define that is to have a private monies on the table. That can be the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, or Wildlife Fund. Now, if those guys are involved, they have their offices at the local level, and they are very much engaged in trying to expedite these things. So that's a real difference.
Good.
Kate,
Thanks. Yeah, Sasha.
Kate, I would love to just share, just from what Scott said. It also depends on, in terms of the political space that you're in your country. So, for instance, in Antigua and Barbuda, our government is relatively, I would say, supportive of NGOs, a majority NGO board. However, whereas that might take us maybe a year, 2 years or so, or 3 years. For some people, it would take years for others, because of the fact that maybe some countries do not want to have a majority NGO board, or that your chair and your vice chair must be the government. So sometimes the politics plays a role that may take a while. So you would have to also understand the political arena in which you live in.
I think that, thanks, Sasha. I think, and thank you to Scott as well. I think that's a good point, that the political climate, the stakeholder consultation process in a lot of cases can be time consuming. And Scott mentioned the way that the Philippine Foundation went from community to community to gain stakeholder input, but really going through that stakeholder and political analysis and ensuring that people's voices are being heard, but also that that there's buy-in to the process, so that there's that there's support for moving forward, because the startup phase needs all the support it can get, whether it's both financial as well as community and human support. So thank you. I just wanted to flag in the chat that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, Karen McDonald-Gale is pointing out that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has a slide that elaborates the phases of a CTF. And I will highlight that those phases have been adopted as part of the practice standards in Annex 1, which Scott referenced, which lays out which standards are most relevant in each phase. But she's pointing out that the timing for establishment ranges, and for their region, the creation of template documents and the existence of similar constitutions helped a bit. Sorry, helped a lot. I think we have just about time for one more question, which from Ajit Cantin, which I'm going to pose. Before I do that, I just want to flag two quick things as we wrap up. One is, we have a LinkedIn online conversation group. Kumar has put the link to that group in the chat. We encourage you to go there, because we can continue this conversation and share resources and discuss experiences. So if you click the LinkedIn link, it's the second to last post in the chat right now. And lastly, just wanted to share that this is the last webinar in this series. So we have one more webinar. It's the last, sorry, I should say it's the last webinar for 2021. We have one more webinar. We are going to wait to schedule it until we have some resources that are being developed. That webinar will be on self-assessment and assessment of CTFs using the standards. So keep an eye for your CFA and REDLAC emails. We'll let you know as soon as that one's scheduled. So with that, I'm going to open up to anyone who wants to take this question from Ajit, which is, how difficult was it to have the government understand that the trust fund needs to be independent and not government managed? That is not a question that's going to get answered in 45 seconds, but I'm going to pose it anyway. Miriam and Sasha, did either of you encounter issues around government control? I think maybe.
Yeah, very brief. For us as a transboundary trust fund, working with 3 countries that are difficult cooperation anyhow, I think we managed quite easily to convince that it would not work with these 3 governments on our board. And but of course, if you have a bilateral of just one fund in one country, it's much more different situation. So I'm not sure if Sasha can answer.
I would just say, like, for us getting started, I don't think there was any kind of resistance in terms of having a majority NGO board. the government was pretty much supportive of the MEPA Trust, so supportive in that they actually took on the responsibility in aiding us to provide our operational manual, giving us office space, those type of things, and helping us in terms of grooming the MEPA Trust and building our capacity. So I would say that the government was pretty much supportive of the MEPA Trust being established.
Great, thank you. Scott, I'm going to give you the last word on this and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, I love the last word. I would say, I just wanted to say quickly, this is actually a trend. I think, 5-10 years ago, it wasn't as difficult to establish funds with NGO majorities. But the more they're created and the more money they accumulate, the more attractive they are to some sort of undue influence on the part of the local government. And so I just say I'm seeing it actually more and more. It's more of a trend globally.
Thanks. I invite people to, as I said, to come to the CFA Online LinkedIn group to continue the conversation on this. And we look forward to seeing everyone in 2022 when we have the last webinar on self-assessment. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you soon.